I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, yet another eruption of vicious, mean-spirited, vitriolic criticism of the State of Israel, following a carefully orchestrated Hamas attack on the State of Israel along the Gaza border. Now, if you're at all hazy on the details of Hamas's latest assault on Israel, here are the facts. In anticipation of Israel's 70th birthday, which the Palestinians see as their Nakba, their disaster, Hamas amassed some 30,000 Palestinians with the explicit purpose of inciting a riot in which Palestinians tried to breach the security fence that separates Gaza from Israel and enter into Israeli territory as a frenzied mob. Those critical of Israel suggest that the protest was motivated by Israel's blockade of Gaza and the demand of a Palestinian right of return. These are issues which have been discussed and debated over and over again. And from an Israeli perspective, they've been more than answered. But Gazan Palestinians, organized by Hamas, using Palestinian children as shields, threw rocks and Molotov firebombs at Israeli troops manning the Israeli border, and at least in one case, opened fire on Israeli soldiers. Imagine this kind of mob attacking any other country. Imagining an enemy throwing firebombs and actually firing on any other country. What would the response be? What would our response be here in America? What should any sovereign country do faced with a similar assault? And the answer seems clear as day. Protect yourself with the minimum force necessary to do the job. And that is exactly what the IDF did in this circumstance. IDF soldiers used tear gas, then rubber bullets, and in extreme situations, live ammunition. Most significantly, IDF soldiers only targeted those engaged in explicit violent action against Israeli troops. Now, in the end, sadly, 15 Palestinians were killed. 10 of them, known Hamas terrorists, wanted in Israel for terrorist actions against Israeli civilians. And according to various reports, anywhere from 700 to 1,000 Palestinians were injured, though it's difficult to know what constitutes injuries in this kind of clash and what caused each injury. But headlines in such prestigious American media as Time call this orchestrated attack on Israel a protest. This wasn't a protest. Americans know what a protest means. We know what marching peacefully across a bridge is like, or what sitting peacefully in acts of civil disobedience are like. It doesn't involve throwing Molotov cocktails, using live ammunition. And the larger fact remains, does anyone question a country's right, an army's right, to defend itself when it's under attack? Who can't see this for what it is? Who can't see the carefully orchestrated, unprovoked attack on a sovereign state or the justice in the Israeli response? The only people unable to see the restraint shown by Israel, by the IDF, are those who are already anti-Israel, if not anti-Semitic, and who view Israel as some kind of illegitimate state with no right to protect itself against besieged and persecuted Palestinians who only want to return to their land, unjustly taken from them in the Nakba of 1948, which of course was the implementation of the partition plan affirmed a year earlier by the United Nations. Nothing about this latest Gaza incident is sane. It's all insane. And to compound the insanity, people like Bernie Sanders make public statements condemning Israel for defending itself against assault. I know there are many Jews who like Bernie Sanders, who voted for Bernie Sanders in the last presidential election. But how ludicrous it is for a respected American senator to condemn another country for defending itself against attack and for blaming Israel for overreacting. Well, for some comment on this whole situation, we are joined by one of American Jewry's most articulate leaders and an ardent defender of the State of Israel, the CEO of the American Jewish Committee, David Harris. David, thank you so much for joining us again. And I want to begin by simply getting your take on the events that took place on the Gaza border.
Well, to me, the storyline about Gaza is very clear. Israel is a country that withdrew from Gaza in 2005, lock, stock, and barrel, wanted only one thing from Gaza: peace, security, stability, quiet. And it couldn't get it. Gaza had a choice with its first chance in history to become sovereign. People don't realize this. Israel gave Gaza its first chance in history to chart its own destiny. The Egyptians never gave it. The Ottomans never gave it. No one else gave it. So they had a choice. And back then we said the choice is essentially between the Singapore model and the Somalia model. Said it 10 years ago. And what did Gaza choose? It chose the Somalia model, essentially meaning not development, but chaos. And now we see it yet again. And what's so shocking is how many in the world community don't get the moral clarity of this issue. Sovereign state, democratic state, simply trying to defend its borders against a terrorist operation that's trying to threaten Israel, intimidate Israel, and eventually destroy Israel. And so when we see some Europeans and Americans sort of with this moral fog that descends upon them, that kind of stand on the 50-yard line between the fireman and the arsonist, I don't get it. I just don't get it. What are they missing here? Why can't they see it? This is pretty obvious, and if the same thing happened in the United States with people massing on our borders, burning tires, throwing Molotov cocktails, how does anyone think the United States or any other democratic country would respond? In the same way, but probably with less restraint than the IDF.
David, you've expressed what bothers me most in the general response to Israel's defending itself, but I want to push you. You speak of people living in a moral fog. David, why isn't it patently clear what's right and wrong in this situation? What's your instinct here? Where does this failure to see the obvious come from? And most specifically, what drives the kind of criticism being leveled at Israel by a Bernie Sanders?
Well, I think if I had to sort of summarize, there probably are two basic schools of criticism of Israel. The harsher, more extreme school is essentially those who, at the end of the day, are never willing to acknowledge Israel's right to defend itself, in some cases not even its right to exist. So from them I expect nothing. Frankly speaking, when President Erdogan of Turkey goes out and lashes Israel, what's new? I mean, that's what he does. He'll look for any pretext, any excuse. Meanwhile, by the way, what he accuses Israel of, he's doing 10 times worse to the Kurds and to others. He takes no prisoners, Erdogan. But then you have the second school that essentially says, you know, we're surrounded by this sort of halo of virtue. And virtue dictates us to support the people we always deem to be the less powerful, the victim, as opposed to the victimizer. And so this allows them this kind of inversion of truth. that somehow the Palestinians in Gaza, by dint of the fact that they're less powerful than Israel, they don't have all of the arsenal of the IDF, by definition deserve support. The fact that they're organized by Hamas, the fact that Hamas is a genocidal organization whose charter calls for the elimination of Israel, the fact that Hamas is on the terrorism list of the United States and the European Union, the fact that Hamas is willing to use women and children as shields, the fact that Hamas lies blatantly to the media about casualty figures, about all the rest, none of this seems to bother them. It all kind of rolls off their virtue, and their virtue keeps them with the poor and the powerless. Something's terribly wrong here. Something is terribly wrong here in their kind of moral GPS. And I think it's incumbent upon us to call them out. Bernie Sanders' tweet was profoundly disappointing here. I mean, he should know what's going on. He should understand right from wrong, the fireman from the arsonist, the democratic nation from the demagogic nation. Maybe he needs a new pair of glasses.
David, your answer is in some way very respectful of the critics of Israel, which sort of impresses me. You did not say they're simply anti-Israel to the core, or that they're anti-Semitic. You seem to be saying they're misguided. Do you really feel that that's the whole story? Or do you feel that for some, it's not about misguided idealism, that painfully it has to do with their being in some way, David, anti-Israel or anti-Semitic?
As I said, I think there are basically two schools of critics. The first school falls into that category. These are people who question not only Israel's right to defend itself, but in many cases, Israel's very right to exist. And by the way, a nation that is not even given the right to defend itself, essentially, in someone's mind, has no right to exist. So would I put the future of Israel and its well-being in the hands of President Erdogan of Turkey? No way in the world. Would I put that future in the hands of the Swedish foreign minister? No way in the world. To read her statements and her tweets is painful, especially in her case coming from such a proudly democratic European country as Sweden. So there are different kinds of people. We can't all put them into sort of one basket and say they're all anti-Semitic, they're all anti-Zionist. No, there are a range of people. There are people who are ignorant. There are people who've fallen for the Hamas media trap. There are people who, as I said, have sort of enveloped themselves in virtue and believe that that virtue leads them to identify with those clamoring for, quote, freedom. And then there are others who are much more malevolent in their intentions and from the very beginning have no desire whatsoever to give Israel any chance whatsoever to defend itself, in other words, to exist.
David, are the Palestinians the underdog in Gaza?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Look, at the end of the day, I'm not envious of the conditions of people who live in Gaza. Until Hamas took over, we at AJC had visited Gaza quite regularly. We've seen it. It's small, it's crowded, but if there are going to be demonstrations by Gazans against their conditions, let them be demonstrations directed at the people responsible for those conditions. And those responsible are those who today govern Gaza. And Israel, again, made very clear, we in Israel have a stake in a Gaza that is stable and developing, not in a Gaza that is unstable and deteriorating. And by the way, the other thing the international community always seems to conveniently forget, Gaza has two borders, not one. Israel, which is the target of the venom of Gaza and Hamas, is only one of the two countries. The other country, of course, is Egypt. Fortunately, Israel and Egypt today have really solid relations. But why is the international community that purports to be concerned about humanitarian conditions only concerned about Israel's alleged role and completely and totally silent about Egypt? As if that boundary doesn't exist, as if a fellow Arab country has zero responsibility for the well-being of Arabs who live in Gaza.
I appreciate your perspective, David. I want to turn to another controversial subject. You and I have not had a chance to speak on JBS about the Trump administration's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and formally moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. There are those in the American Jewish community who feel that President Donald Trump has said and done things that have been very positive for the State of Israel and for rebuilding relationships that had become problematic under the Obama administration. At the same time, David, there are many, many American Jews who detest Donald Trump. And there are Jews at the AJC who have no use for him whatsoever. Now, David, I understand the position you're in. And I'm not asking you about Donald Trump. I'm asking you about the Trump administration and Trump administration policy as it applies to the State of Israel and the kind of situation we see in Gaza. How do you rate the Trump administration's treatment of Israel during Donald Trump's first year in office?
We probably don't have enough time on your show to try and answer all of the many good questions that you've asked there, Mark. But let me be absolutely clear up front. AJC is a strictly nonpartisan organization. It doesn't matter what individual staff members or others may think. They have every right to think whatever they think. But on AJC time, we are strictly nonpartisan, we are independent, and we are centrist. We don't take a position on the administration per se. We take a position on the policies and the statements of this administration, like other administrations. And frankly speaking, there are positions this administration has taken which we welcome and support. There are others which we have not hesitated to criticize. Go back to the Obama administration, the very same thing. In this case, we happen to think that the decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and to move the embassy to Jerusalem on May the 14th was the right decision. And we said so. This is not because we embrace Donald Trump or reject Donald Trump. It was the right decision. Too many Americans and American Jews, I fear, are personalizing this. Meaning, if they don't like Donald Trump, they're not prepared to support any position that he takes, even if otherwise they might think it's the right position. Heaven forbid they should give him any credit. That's not the way to approach Jewish advocacy issues. Certainly not the way we at AJC approach them. Take the embassy issue. There are 193 member states of the United Nations. 192 have the sovereign right to decide where their embassy is going to be. And no one else, no third country can tell them you can't put it there. So most recently, Germany decides after unification to move its embassy from Bonn to Berlin. I have no doubt that this cost tens and hundreds of millions of dollars to individual countries to relocate their embassies from Bonn to Berlin. But no one said anything, because everyone understood that this is Germany's right to choose its own city. I'm sure, having just been in Australia a few days ago, that most countries would much rather have the capital city in either Sydney or Melbourne, great cities. Instead, they chose Canberra. People go to Canberra. They may or may not like it, they go there. Israel is the only nation on earth that is not accorded the right for designating its own capital city. And yet, the hypocrisy goes further than that, Mark, because every world leader who denies Israel the right to do so travels to Jerusalem, not to Tel Aviv, in order to meet the president, the prime minister, the speaker of the Knesset, the foreign ministry, the Supreme Court, because that's where they all live and work. So they travel to Jerusalem at the very same time that they deny Jerusalem as being the capital. Why? Because of a resolution adopted 70 years ago at the United Nations, which the Arab world itself completely and totally rejected. So we're told by critics of this decision, it's not the right time. So for 70 years, it's not been the right time. Meaning for 70 years, the Palestinians have been able to control the process by rejecting every peace initiative put on the table, including two-state accords put on the table in recent years, and at the same time, to have their cake and eat it too. The Trump administration comes along and says, you know what, we're going to change the dynamic of this. We're going to face reality, Jerusalem is the capital, and we're going to send a message to the Palestinians as well, you're no longer going to control the tempo of this. You're going to have to accept certain facts. I hope you like them. If you don't like them, tough. This is the way we're going forward. We applaud that.
You know, David, you say it as well as anyone, and you certainly do express my feelings. But there are those who would sit opposite us and argue Jerusalem is a city whose ultimate sovereignty has yet to be decided. And it's supposed to be decided in direct bilateral negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. And what Donald Trump has done precludes that dynamic, which was supposed to be part of the peace process. And so while many Jews may be emotionally thrilled with Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and of course, Israel should have the right to designate where its capital is, Jerusalem is a unique capital, unlike Germany's capital or Australia's capital, unlike any other capital in the world. And that's why, so many argue, Israel had to wait. That when Israel makes peace with the Palestinians, then they can determine where Israel's capital is. How do you respond?
My response, Mark, would be quite simple. What the administration did was recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. What it did not do was foreclose the possibility that one day in a peace agreement, should there be a peace agreement, that Jerusalem's boundaries could be arranged in such a way that it could become the capital of a Palestinian state. There's nothing in what the administration did that precludes any of that from happening. It simply acknowledges that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, as Israel itself has declared since 1949, or go back to the time of King David if you wish. That this is where the government of Israel is, this is where world leaders visit. That's that. This in no way determines the future status of other parts of Jerusalem or the eventual boundaries of the city of Jerusalem.
Okay, one last issue. Ron Lauder publishes an op-ed piece in the New York Times saying, in essence, that Israel's future as a viable Jewish and democratic state depends upon its implementing a two-state solution. David, what's your reaction to that Lauder op-ed?
So first of all, I think AJC may have been the first major Jewish organization to embrace a two-state ideal a couple of decades ago. So we're not new to this issue, and we're certainly not new to the core argument that Israel needs to preserve both its Jewish and its democratic character. These are not new and novel issues that were discovered in 2018, far from it. We've been talking about these issues since the early 1990s, since just after the Madrid peace process of 1991. So nothing new in the ideal, Mark. I must confess, when I saw the piece, I had to read it twice. I was a little taken aback by the piece. It was meant to be associated with Israel's 70th anniversary. I happen to think, and I've written my own essay on Israel at 70, that there's a whole different story to be told at this point in time about what the 70th anniversary of Israel means, without, from 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 miles away, sort of lecturing Israel on what it needs to do in order to go forward. Israel has done quite well these last 70 years, thank you very much, despite all of the critics and skeptics about how it could survive, much less thrive. Number one. And number two, really implicit in the question you asked, perhaps Ron Lauder sees something that I don't see, the possibility of a two-state agreement today. In theory, again, it would be a wonderful possibility. In practice, I see a Palestinian leadership that's missing in action. It's been missing in action for years. I have to ask the question, number one, Gaza is in the hands of Hamas. The West Bank is in the hands of the Palestinian Authority. How do you even begin to develop a two-state agreement when in reality you have a three-state prospect on the ground? Number two, there's no succession process for Mahmoud Abbas. Mahmoud Abbas is in his 80s. He recently went to Baltimore for medical issues at Johns Hopkins University Hospital. There is no succession planning. So even if today's Israeli government were determined, absolutely, to sign an agreement with someone, who are they signing it with? And what happens when Mahmoud Abbas leaves the scene? What happens next? We know that Israel will abide by its agreements, come what may, because we've seen it time and again, even with shifts in government. What's going to happen on the Palestinian side? So with whom? But the reality is there is no with whom, because you have Mahmoud Abbas that didn't show up at the White House when the conference was held on assistance to Gaza. Arab countries sat with Israel. There was no Palestinian Authority. I can go down a long list. And instead of trying to move closer to the table, Mahmoud Abbas is trying to internationalize the conflict. He's going in the exact opposite direction of where he should be going. At the end of the day, as you said, Mark, it's only between Israel and the Palestinians that a deal will be struck. It's not between the Palestinians and the UN. So, I read this piece. At first, it kind of sounds okay. And then the more you deconstruct it, the more you realize, from my perspective, it's completely separated from the reality that we see today on the ground.
David, do you support maintaining the status quo in Gaza and the West Bank? There are those who argue that the status quo will cause the world community to impose a one-state solution on Israel from the Jordan to the Mediterranean, which means that millions of Palestinians will have the right to vote inside Israel, and that would mean an end to a Jewish democratic state of Israel.
I say, first of all, and I say this with sadness, there is no optimal solution here. If there were, it would have been tried by now. We have a set of bad and worse policy options. That's what Israel is stuck with. It's stuck with, on the one hand, the reality that as long as the status quo continues, there are threats to the moral, the democratic, and the Jewish character of the state of Israel. On the other hand, if Israel acts unilaterally, absent a peace partner, we run the same risks that we now see in Gaza or in southern Lebanon. Hamas filling the void in Gaza, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. So Israel is stuck between a rock and a hard place with no easy choices.
You know, David, there are some wonderful people leading major institutions of Jewish life, but we are so lucky. I'm so lucky. American Jewry is so lucky. Israel is so lucky. World Jewry is so lucky that you're leading the AJC as you have for more than 2 decades. You are fabulous in your heart and in the way you so beautifully articulate a rational, thoughtful, sensitive approach to the most complex issues facing Jewish life today. So I thank you for always making time for me and JBS. You've been a dear friend to what we've been doing here. And here we are talking during Chol HaMoed Pesach. By the way, David, how many people were at your Seder this year?
Well, we moved from a suburban house to a city apartment, so we went from 40 to 14, and we were lucky to squeeze 14 into the apartment.
Well, Mazal Tov. I am sure it was a wonderful Simcha evening and a wonderful Seder night.
It was.
And again, I thank you
all
for all
credit
you
to
do.
my wife.
Yes,
Totally, 100%.
I understand.
It's a labor of love.
Kol hakavod to her, absolutely. But I'm also saying kol hakavod to you. Kol tuv v'atzlacha. You continue to do the work you're doing for all of us, and I will continue to chase you and put you on JBS as much as I can. Thank you so very much, David.
Thanks, Mark.
The thoughts and insights of David Harris, CEO of the American Jewish Committee. My thanks, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.